So we've had the budget, it's been and gone, and the media are obsessing themselves over national insurance, and rightly so, because it is a big increase, and although it was expected, maybe it was not expected to be quite such a big increase. But for us investors, stroke landlords, there's a number of interesting things which will probably get overlooked. The first thing I want to say is that if you think back to previous budgets, you'll realise that the Chancellor at the dispatch box only usually gives the sort of the broad headlines and the bits which they want us to remember. When you actually read through the detail of the budget, it's all the stuff which wasn't announced at the time, which can actually be particularly painful. So I'm reserving judgment in its entirety until I've seen what the small print is, and no doubt there'll be different institutions and organisations emailing me over the next few days saying, by the way, did you know that this was snuck through and this will affect you? If that does happen, and if I see something particularly pertinent or particularly painful, I will of course let you know. But I think the interesting thing is the underlying narrative that we can get as investors and landlords from this budget, because there was some surprise in the media that rates of capital gains tax for residential property weren't increased. But there was a reason for that, as I understand it, because anecdotally I have heard that prior to the budget there was a discussion that rates of capital gains tax applicable to residential properties would be increased, but the government decided that they wanted to make an exit for landlords relatively easy. Because the thing that's happened in previous budgets is, and I don't know if you ever noticed this, but when there's been talk about capital gains tax increasing, the media has sort of gone completely berserk and lost their heads and printed articles saying all the landlords are going to exit the market, blah, blah, blah. But actually, when capital gains tax has gone up, most landlords and investors have said, well, there's no point in selling, I'll just sit on my investment and keep it. And in this particular instance, I'm led to understand that the government, because they don't really want individuals, private individuals, people like you and me being investors stroke landlords in the private rental sector, they've left the door open for us to leave by not putting the tax up. So that's the interesting sub-narrative, which I guess won't be picked up by the media, but it seems self-evident to me that it's happening, because on the one side they're saying, here you are, the door is still open, we haven't increased capital gains tax, if you want to sell you can still sell and just pay the old tax that you would have paid before the budget. Thank you very much, Rachel. On the other hand, obviously the big news is stamp duty going up, and stamp duty going up as of midnight on budget day, and inevitably it's caused problems. Now, we haven't seen the full fallout from it, but I was interested to see the day after. On the Thursday, the budget was on the Wednesday, on the Thursday, Sky News running this article about the problems that have been occurring since the budget with people pulling out of house deals. So let me just click on this and we'll have a look at this. So the article is talking about how deals were pulled just minutes after the Chancellor announced a rise in stamp duty for second homes in the budget yesterday. Brokers reported clients either pulling out of deals or trying to renegotiate. Bound to, aren't they? I mean, it depends on where you're buying, but as the surcharge has now gone up to 5%, and remember that's the surcharge, that's not the amount you pay. If it's a more expensive property, you're going to be paying, I don't know what, 7, 8, 9, 10%, because it's the rate plus the 5%. It's the normal rate plus the 5%. So it's becoming very, very expensive. Why are the government doing this? Because they want to dissuade landlord investors from buying residential properties. Rachel Reeves herself, I think, made a throwaway comment during the budget that it was to help first-time buyers. Now, a fundamental misunderstanding, I think, that many politicians have is that not every buy-to-let investor is competing with first-time buyers. Now, some are, I'm sure they are. I can't say that it doesn't happen at all. But for myself, for example, most of the properties I've ever bought have been in very poor condition, properties which a first-time buyer wouldn't want, and properties which a first-time buyer wouldn't be able to finance because they're not in good condition. Basically, a first-time buyer wants to get a 90 or 95% mortgage. They save up their 5% or 10% deposit, which is hard for them. They don't have the money over and above to be able to do the refurb. So if there's a refurb which is going to cost 10,000, 15,000, 20,000, the first-time buyer invariably is not going to be able to afford to do that. That being the case, a lot of the properties which I have bought needing a refurb of 10, £15,000-20,000, or the equivalent in today's money at least, I've done the refurb. First-time buyers were not in the market. I was not competing with them. The other thing which politicians tend to overlook as well, in their desire to dissuade private individuals from being property investors, is, well, if it's not going to be the private individuals providing buy-to-lets, who's actually going to provide the rental properties that the country needs? Now, they may argue that the big institutions want to come in and be big landlords, and that's true. There are a number of big institutions, one particular bank who I won't name, who want to be in the game, apparently, and they want to be property investors. And in fact, they've actually even written rather scathing articles, which the media have lapped up and republished, saying how poor the private rental sector is because it's full of people like you and me. But what the politicians don't understand is that those big institutions are not going to want to buy the properties, for example, that I've been buying, and they're not going to want to rent the properties out to the people who I rent properties out to. My properties, for example, and I'm just using me as an example because I can speak about me as an example because I know what I do. I'm sure this applies to a lot of investors and landlords across the country. I have been buying properties up in the northeast, which are relatively cheap. A lot of them, as I say, have needed work to bring them back into use as properties. They were basically uninhabitable, but I brought them back into use. But I've been letting many of my properties to people on benefits. Now, I do not believe that the big institutions are going to be going out and buying cheap properties in the northeast and letting them to people on housing benefit, or well, benefits, not housing benefit, doesn't exist anymore. People on universal credit. It's just not going to happen. They are probably going to want to buy more expensive properties in the middle of London, who they can let to young professionals at exorbitant rents to make their model work. If it's going to be any other way, I'd be absolutely amazed. So it's all very well for the government to try and bring in this sort of dissuading factor. On the one hand, we've got the carrot of capital gains tax hasn't gone up, so it's no more expensive to exit the market, but stamp duty has gone up, which means it's harder to get into the market. But who's going to provide the rental properties? It's not going to be those institutions, Rachel Reeves, if you happen to listen to this. Are you subscribed, Rachel? Then it's not going to be them, and you're going to end up with a situation where it's going to be down to you, again, the government. How are you going to do that? Are you building all the council houses? You want to? Can you? We will see, won't we? We will see. But the upshot of all of this is obviously that with the stamp duty going up so quickly, it's caused all sorts of problems. And you've either had to find the extra 2%. I mean, for people who are completing today or completing this week, the week of the budget, on the Friday afternoon, they've either got to make a decision. Do they find the extra money or do they pull out? But if they've already exchanged contracts, can they pull out? I mean, there's going to be the financial problems for them if they do pull out. The buyers obviously could sue for specific performance. There's all sorts of things that could happen. It's not, you just can't ring up your solicitor and say, do you know what, I know the exchange contracts, but I'm off. You can't do that. So for some people it's going to cause real problems. But the big question which I'm wondering about, and which hasn't actually been reported yet, is what is the bank's attitude to this going to be? Because I think naively some investors assume that once you've had your mortgage offer and once you've exchanged contracts, then the bank is sort of duty bound to provide the money at the point of completion. But of course they're not. And we've seen in the past, particularly sort of after the credit crunch in 2007, particularly the new builds, that the banks were pulling their lending for buyers of new builds on the day of completion. Well, I can see a situation here where perhaps the bank says, hang on a second, we put this mortgage offer together based upon this set of figures, but the set of figures has now changed. In effect, your purchase price has now changed. Your stamp duty has now gone up by 2%. That's thrown your figures out. So we either can't lend you as much or we're not going to lend to you at all. So sorry about that. Now, for somebody who's already exchanged contracts, the mortgage offer is worthless. If the bank decide to pull the money, they pull the money. And there's not very much you can do about it. Which means that it's not just a problem for those who are finding the extra 2%. Some people might be left having to find 100% of the money or face being sued by the seller. So I think the whole thing was a bit crazy. I can see why they want to do it, because that is the narrative, you know. Nobody likes a landlord, nobody likes an investor. That's just the way it is. You know, they're not proper working people, and we've been through all of that, and Saki has explained what a proper working person is. And he may be right. I don't know. I mean, you know, we all go on about passive income, so I mean, we can't sort of turn around and say, no, actually, this is work. But you know, at the end of the day, though, it could cause an awful lot of problems for not just investors, but the end user who is the renter. And one thing which the press, to be fair, have been flagging up about this is that if the government are going to try and dissuade private individuals like you and me from being investors and landlords, then the upshot is going to be there's going to be less rental properties and rents will go up, unless of course they can provide another source of rental properties. But as I say, don't look to the big institutions who are saying they want to come in and be buy-to-let landlords, because I don't think that they will be providing the sort of property which the country really needs, which is the cheap and cheerful properties for people who are on sort of lower incomes, people who have just sort of come out of school, starting work, people who are on benefits. All of those people are going to get left behind. They won't have anywhere to live. So anyway, just some very initial thoughts on the budget. As I say, if I see anything else which has got a direct impact on us, whether good or bad, and which is buried in the small print and yet to come out, I will let you know. In the meantime, please do come over and visit me at my website, thepropertyteacher.co.uk, where you'll find all sorts of resources. You'll find my blog, you'll find free special reports, you'll find my ebooks and my courses, and it'd be great to see you over there. So please do come over and visit me, thepropertyteacher.co.uk.
I'm going to go at 12:30.
It's going to be a bit weird not having you here knowing you're in the cinema. You're not meeting another man, are you, sweet pea?